Imagine you've spent 2 years fighting in the scorching deserts of North Africa. You've watched your friends die. You've survived on hard biscuits and watered-down coffee. You've been told your entire life that America is weak, divided, soft, a nation of cowards too comfortable to fight. And then, the day you surrender, expecting a bullet or a cage or starvation, a smiling American soldier hands you a bottle of something cold, dark, and fizzing. You've never seen anything like it. You take one sip, and in that single moment, everything your government ever told you begins to crack. That is exactly what happened to 371,683 German soldiers captured during World War II. And what they discovered in American prison camps didn't just shock them, it didn't just confuse them, it destroyed them. Not with bombs, not with bayonets, but with ice cream, with chocolate bars, with a 5-cent bottle of Coca-Cola that tasted, as one Afrika Korps veteran would later say, like drinking the future. This is the story of the most unusual psychological victory in the history of modern warfare. A story that military historians have quietly called one of the most effective ideological demolitions ever recorded. And it wasn't planned, it wasn't a program, it wasn't propaganda. It was just America being America. And that was more than enough. Stay with me, because what these men witnessed inside those prison camps will change how you understand power, abundance, and what democracy actually looks like when it's living and breathing and filling your bowl with a second scoop of strawberry ice cream on a Tuesday afternoon. It begins in the dust and fire of Tunisia, May 1943. The Afrika Korps, Rommel's legendary desert warriors, had been the most feared fighting force in the entire theater of war. These were not green conscripts. These were hardened, battle-tested veterans who had driven the British back to the gates of Egypt, who had fought under one of Germany's most brilliant military minds, who had endured scorching heat and freezing nights and months of brutal combat in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. They believed they were the best soldiers in the world. Their propaganda told them so every single day. And then the noose tightened. American and British forces closed from both sides. Supply lines collapsed. Ammunition ran dry. Food had already been rationed down to near nothing. And in the first weeks of May 1943, in what would become one of the largest surrenders in the entire war, approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms in the Tunisian dust. They expected the worst. Nazi doctrine was explicit about what happened to soldiers who surrendered. Weakness was punished. Enemies were brutal. Americans, in particular, according to years of relentless propaganda, were soft and decadent on the surface, but vicious and treacherous underneath. Prisoners, the soldiers had been told, could expect starvation, beatings, humiliation, and death. So when American soldiers approached the first processing camps with their arms full of K-rations and began handing them out, crackers, processed cheese, fruit bars, candy, instant coffee with actual sugar tablets, the German prisoners didn't know what to think. These were American military field rations, standard issue, the thing American GIs routinely complained about when they wanted something better, the bottom rung of American military food. And to men who had been living on hard biscuits and ersatz coffee for months, it was a banquet. But that was just the beginning. Within days, at the larger processing camps set up across North Africa, the U.S. Army began serving real meals, not field rations, actual cooked food. Military records from those camps document breakfasts that included pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, and milk. Not powdered eggs, real ones. Not reconstituted milk, fresh ones. Foods that many of these soldiers had not tasted since the late 1930s, before the war even ended. Foods that many of these soldiers had not tasted since the late 1930s. A German officer later provided formal testimony to the International Red Cross, struggling to put into words what that first meal meant. He said, "We expected to be starved as prisoners. Instead, the Americans fed us better than our own army had. This confusion about American resources began our education. Confusion, that is the word he chose, because what these men were experiencing did not compute. It did not fit into any framework they had been given for understanding the world. And that cognitive dissonance, that grinding, unavoidable sense that something was profoundly wrong with everything they had been taught, would only deepen with every single passing day. Because they hadn't even gotten on the ships yet. The Liberty ships that carried German prisoners across the Atlantic in the summer of 1943 themselves were a lesson in American industrial power that none of these men were prepared for. These vessels, mass-produced at a peak that stunned the entire world, were being completed at peak production at the rate of one ship every 42 hours. Not weeks, not days, hours. The Americans were building entire ocean-going vessels the way a factory produces cars. The shipyards never stopped, the cranes never rested, and the ships kept coming, one after another, in a continuous steel flood that the entire German naval ministry could not have imagined. Up to 30,000 prisoners were transported monthly across the Atlantic aboard these ships, and the rations provided to prisoners aboard these vessels matched, in some cases exceeded, the standard provisions given to the American crew members themselves. Approximately 3,500 calories per day, fresh bread, meat, vegetables, coffee with sugar and real milk. The ships had refrigeration systems as standard equipment, which meant the food stayed fresh across the entire 2-week crossing. And then, and this is where veteran soldiers who had survived 2 years of desert warfare reportedly fell completely silent, the ice cream came out. On July 4, 1943, the USS General M.B. Stewart was crossing the Atlantic with a full load of German prisoners. The ship's log records it plainly, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of military documentation. Ice cream was served to the prisoners that day, produced by the ship's onboard ice cream maker, which could churn out 10 gallons per batch. It was Independence Day, and the Americans celebrated the way Americans celebrate, with dessert, and the enemies they were transporting across an ocean got some too. Try to put yourself in the mind of a German prisoner sitting in the mid-Atlantic on a ship unlike anything he'd seen, eating 3 meals a day of food better than he'd had in years, and watching an American sailor bring out a machine that made ice cream in the middle of the ocean. He had not tasted ice cream before the war. Most of his unit hadn't. Ice cream in Germany by 1943 was not merely scarce, it was essentially extinct for ordinary people. Sugar was rationed, dairy was rationed. The infrastructure to produce and refrigerate frozen desserts had been redirected entirely toward the war economy. And here it was, in a bowl, on a military transport in the Atlantic Ocean. One account from a prisoner describes the moment as surreal, like watching someone perform a magic trick that violated the laws of physics. Several men reportedly stared at the bowls for a long moment before they would touch them, as if the ice cream would disappear when they reached for it. It did not disappear. And when the ships docked at ports like Norfolk and Newport News, Virginia, the education continued at a scale that went far beyond what food alone could convey. The Norfolk Naval Base in 1943 covered 4,300 acres of waterfront. German prisoners, transported by bus and truck from the docks, could see the scale of it, the endless facilities, the mountains of supplies, the sheer mechanical roar of an industrial nation at full war production. Military records show that this single port facility handled more cargo in a single day than major German ports managed in an entire week. And the Germans knew what German ports looked like. They knew the comparison was real. At the port exchanges, shops serving dock workers and military personnel, prisoners glimpsed shelves stocked with candy bars. Not one kind, not two kinds, dozens of varieties from major manufacturers like Hershey, Mars, and Nestle, stacked in casual abundance, sitting at standard prices, 5 cents for most candy bars, the same price you'd pay anywhere in America. The same price a child might pay with coins from a piggy bank. Military procurement records from 1943 confirm that these exchanges stocked extraordinary variety.
Dozens of candy types available simultaneously, sold casually, purchased by ordinary workers on ordinary lunch breaks. For prisoners who came from a country where chocolate had become a military priority-only item by 1943, watching a dock worker buy a Hershey bar and eat half of it while walking back to his station and then throw the rest away was not just surprising, it was shattering. The journey to the prison camps by train only deepened the wound. In Europe, prisoners were transported in cattle cars, crowded, filthy, standing room only. It was a deliberate humiliation, and everyone knew it. German soldiers had seen what those cars were used for. The imagery was inescapable. The Americans put them in passenger coaches. Documented menus from July 1943 prison transport trains show the dining car served fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and coffee, not as a special gesture of mercy, not as a calculated propaganda move, but because this was simply how American railroads fed people. It was standard rail service. The prisoners discovered, through their guards' casual indifference, that this wasn't special treatment for enemies. This was just what the train served. And then they arrived at the camps themselves. Camp Crossville, Tennessee, Camp Shelby, Mississippi, Camp Hearn, Texas, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. Dozens of facilities scattered across the American interior, housing German prisoners in conditions that met and in most cases significantly exceeded the requirements of the Geneva Convention. Electric lights, hot running water, flush toilets, heated barracks in winter, recreational facilities, libraries. The camps were not luxurious, they were functional military facilities, but they were clean, organized, and humane in ways that genuinely confused men trained to expect brutality. But it was the camp exchanges, the PX stores, that delivered the most sustained psychological impact. Because the PX wasn't a one-time experience, it wasn't a welcome meal or a first impression designed to lower resistance. It was a permanent, ongoing, everyday feature of prison camp life. And it stocked items that by 1943 had become fantasy objects in German civilian life. Multiple brands of soft drinks, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, RC Cola, candy bars of multiple varieties, ice cream where refrigeration permitted, cigarettes, fresh fruit, snacks. Army quartermaster records list all of it, itemized and documented, delivered on regular schedules to camps across the country. And prisoners could actually buy these things. Men who worked received wages, 80 cents per day for labor, later raised to $1. With candy bars at 5 cents each and Coca-Cola at the same price, a single day's wages could purchase 16 items. 16! In Germany, these products weren't just expensive by late 1943. They were essentially unavailable to ordinary people at any price, without special connections and black market access. In America, an enemy prisoner earned enough in one workday to buy 16 of them. Let that land for a moment. The Coca-Cola situation in particular became almost mythological among the prisoner population. The Coca-Cola company's wartime production had reached numbers that seemed physically impossible to men from a rationed economy. 5 billion bottles produced in 1943 alone. 5 billion. The military contract guaranteed 5-cent Coca-Cola to American servicemen worldwide, a logistical commitment that required a distribution infrastructure of staggering complexity. And German prisoners discovered that this drink, which most of them had never encountered before their capture, was everywhere in America. Every camp received regular deliveries, work details sent outside camp observed vending machines and coolers at gas stations, factories, schools, and soda fountains. Americans of every age and social class drank it casually, sometimes leaving bottles half empty without a second thought. Historical records from the Coca-Cola Company's archives confirmed that many prison camps received weekly deliveries of 200 to 300 cases, each containing 24 bottles. Camp Hearn, Texas alone consumed approximately 7,000 bottles every single week during the summer of 1943. 7,000 bottles per week at a prison camp for enemy soldiers. German prisoners with technical backgrounds, engineers, factory managers, logistics officers, became almost obsessed with a detail that their counterparts back home would have found extraordinary. The Coca-Cola tasted exactly the same whether you drank it in Maine or Texas. Identical flavor, identical carbonation, identical sweetness. Across a nation of continental scale, one product had achieved a standardization of quality that exceeded anything German industry had accomplished for any consumer product. The syrup, manufactured in Atlanta and distributed to bottling plants nationwide, represented a feat of industrial coordination that directly contradicted the Nazi characterization of America as a chaotic, disorganized, racially divided nation incapable of complex, organized effort. The ice cream struck a different nerve, deeper, more personal. Army records confirm that ice cream was regularly served in camps with adequate refrigeration during summer months, not as a special occasion, not as a reward, as a routine. The military considered ice cream sufficiently important to troop morale that specialized ice cream-making vessels had been constructed specifically for the Pacific Fleet because American military planners had decided that sailors deserved frozen dessert during the island campaigns. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, the July 4th celebration in 1943 included a public ice cream making demonstration. Prisoners watched as American staff operated hand-cranked freezers, producing gallons of frozen dessert using ice, salt, cream, sugar, and flavorings. The process itself was not remarkable. What was remarkable was the casual use of resources it represented. Ice in July, cream and sugar deployed not for nutrition, but for entertainment food, for celebration, for pleasure, while German civilians were rationed to 280 grams of sugar per person per month, when available. By 1944, many camps had upgraded to electric ice cream makers. The variety expanded: chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, butter pecan. Prisoners could purchase ice cream bars for 10 cents, ice cream sandwiches for the same, or cups of various flavors from the PX. Larger camps ordered 50 to 100 gallons weekly during summer months. Men who had spent years in the Africa Corps, who had watched friends die of thirst in the desert, were eating ice cream on Tuesday afternoons in Tennessee. And the sugar was its own kind of psychological warfare, completely unintentional. In the camp mess halls, sugar sat in bowls on the tables, open bowls, available for unlimited use, no tickets, no rations, no careful measuring of grams per person, just bowls of refined white sugar sitting there every meal for anyone who wanted some for their coffee or cereal or whatever they were eating. Army quartermaster records from 1943 to 1945 show camps receiving 100-pound bags of refined sugar on weekly supply schedules. Camp bakeries used it without restraint. Cakes appeared on menus, cookies, pies, sweetened cereals, desserts at every dinner service. And then came the incident at Camp Aliceville, Alabama in August 1943 that became one of the most cited anecdotes in the entire documented history of German prisoners in America. The summer heat had caused several hundred pounds of sugar to harden and clump in storage, making it difficult to use properly in kitchen operations. The American kitchen staff examined it, determined it wasn't worth the effort to steam and recover, a process that German kitchen workers would have considered absolutely mandatory for any quantity of rationed food, and ordered it discarded. Then they ordered replacement supplies. German kitchen workers that day reportedly reacted with visible distress, not anger, distress, the kind of distress you feel when you watch someone do something that violates everything you believe to be true about scarcity and value. Several prisoners were told to continue working. The image of hundreds of pounds of sugar being thrown away while their families in Germany were rationing 280 grams per month was simply too much to process quietly.
The chocolate was relentless in its message. Major manufacturers, Hershey, Mars, and Nestle, were producing millions of bars monthly despite the existence of wartime restrictions on ingredients.
The military alone purchased 380 million pounds of chocolate products across the war years. Prison camp exchanges stocked multiple varieties simultaneously: standard Hershey bars, emergency ration chocolate bars, various candy bars containing chocolate, all priced between 5 and 10 cents. And prisoners discovered something that struck them as almost philosophically significant. Americans had preferences among chocolate brands. They would casually choose one over another, comparing them, expressing mild opinions about which was better, as if the question of which type of freely available chocolate they preferred was a reasonable thing to spend mental energy on. In Germany, by this point, chocolate was a military priority item. German children had, in many cases, forgotten what it tasted like. The Red Cross packages distributed monthly to prisoners included chocolate bars as standard items. The American Red Cross documented these packages carefully: chocolate or candy bars, instant coffee, processed cheese, crackers, canned meat, cigarettes. These packages supplemented the regular 3 meals per day the prisoners were already receiving. They were extras, luxury additions to an already adequate diet, and they exceeded what German civilians received as their basic allotted rations. Let that reverse sink in completely. The extras given to enemy prisoners in American camps exceeded the basic survival rations of German civilians on the home front. Then came Thanksgiving, November 1943, a holiday that had no equivalent in German culture, a purely American celebration, rooted in mythology and tradition, involving the national coordination of food production, distribution, and consumption at a scale that defied belief. Army records confirm that every single prison camp in America served a traditional Thanksgiving dinner: roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk. The logistics of providing this meal to 425,000 German prisoners while simultaneously serving it to millions of American servicemen worldwide required organizational capacity that the German Wehrmacht Supply Corps would have struggled to achieve for ammunition delivery, let alone festive food. And German prisoners ate the same meal as American soldiers: the same turkey, the same pie, the same coffee with milk. No distinction between captor and captive at the mess hall table. This was not lost on men trained in the rigid hierarchies of Nazi Germany, where social class, racial classification, and rank determined absolutely everything about what you ate, where you sat, and how you were treated. The casual equality of the mess hall, where a German prisoner of war received the same Thanksgiving dinner as an American sergeant, contradicted the entire ideological framework they had been handed since childhood. And then Christmas arrived, and it brought something none of them had been remotely prepared for. American civilians sent gifts to the German prisoners. Not soldiers, not aid workers, civilians. Church groups, civic organizations, and ordinary individuals, people who had sons and brothers and fathers fighting against Germany in the Pacific and Europe, sent packages to their enemies. The American Friends Service Committee alone distributed 50,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners that year. Local communities organized their own efforts. In Tonkawa, Oklahoma, townspeople delivered homemade treats to the Germans at Camp Tonkawa. In Hearne, Texas, church groups brought Christmas cookies and candy to Camp Hearne. Homemade cookies, candy, books, games, toiletries, writing materials, cigarettes, from American civilians to German prisoners at Christmas. This broke something fundamental in how these men understood the world. They had been trained to see strength as the willingness to dominate and punish enemies. To show mercy was weakness. To feed an enemy was foolishness. To give gifts to the people your sons were fighting was incomprehensible, an act so contrary to everything Nazi ideology taught that many prisoners initially suspected a trap. Some interrogations of prisoners during this period show men who genuinely did not know how to explain American civilian behavior using any framework they possessed. It wasn't weakness. The Americans were clearly not weak. Every supply delivery, every piece of camp infrastructure, every ship and train and truck made that undeniable. It wasn't propaganda. The homemade cookies from the church ladies in Oklahoma were not a coordinated ideological program. It was something else entirely, something these men had been told didn't exist. Strength expressing itself through generosity. Power comfortable enough in its own abundance to give rather than take. By 1944, as the war entered its grinding final phase, prisoner work details outside the camps began providing what amounted to a graduate education in American productive capacity. Approximately 100,000 German prisoners were deployed in agricultural and food processing work across the country, and what they witnessed there, in the orchards and canneries and processing plants of rural America, completed the demolition that had begun with a K-ration in a Tunisian processing camp. In Michigan orchards, prisoners picked cherries, not for food, not for preserves essential to civilian nutrition, for maraschino cherry production, those bright red garnishes placed on top of ice cream sundaes. Decorative cherries, single orchards producing literal tons of fruit for the purpose of making dessert prettier. The prisoners did the math. They knew what German fruit production looked like. They knew what German civilian nutrition looked like. And they stood in American orchards picking decorative cherries by the ton. At canneries, they observed quality control processes that seemed like deliberate mockery of scarcity. Del Monte records from 1944 show that approximately 15% of fruit was rejected for canning due to size irregularities or minor blemishes. Perfectly edible food, nutritious and wholesome, diverted to animal feed because it wasn't pretty enough for American grocery store shelves. 15%. That fraction of fruit, the portion America casually fed to animals, would have been fought over by German civilians. Sugar beet processing operations in Colorado and Nebraska revealed agricultural mechanization at a scale that simply had no equivalent in German agriculture. Single American farms, one property, one family's land produced more sugar beet than entire regions of Germany. And American sugar production from both cane and beets combined reached approximately 7 million tons annually. 7 million tons. Germany's sugar was rationed, produced from beets alone, and chronically insufficient. America was producing 7 million tons per year and still putting open bowls of it on mess hall tables for prisoners to use freely. Prisoners who worked near schools witnessed something that affected them in ways they found difficult to articulate in their letters home. American children, ordinary children in ordinary schools in towns that would never appear on any important map, received hot lunches, milk, protein, vegetables, every day. And in some school cafeterias, children could purchase ice cream for additional money. The concept of children buying frozen desserts at school as a routine, unremarkable option on an ordinary school day, while German children faced food shortages that were approaching crisis levels, created a specific kind of despair in the prisoner observers that was different from anything else they experienced. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even envy exactly, it was closer to grief. A deep, quiet understanding that the world they had been fighting for, the world Nazi Germany had promised them, was not just losing, it had never been real. The German superiority they had been told was destiny, the inevitable triumph of will and race and discipline over soft democratic weakness, it was a lie. And the truth was a plate of food in a school cafeteria in Mississippi. When minimum security prisoners were permitted to eat at American diners under guard escort, they encountered the democratic abundance in its most human form. These were not government facilities, not military installations, small restaurants serving ordinary Americans, workforcers, teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, at prices anyone could afford. Documented price lists from 1944 show a hamburger at 25 cents, Coca-Cola at 5 cents, a slice of pie at 15 cents, an ice cream sundae at 25 cents, a full dinner special at 65 to 70 cents. But the food was almost secondary. What the prisoners couldn't stop staring at was who was eating it and how.
A factory worker and a bank president at adjacent counter stools, eating identical meals, served by the same waitress for the same price with the same casual ease. No hierarchy of service, no differential treatment based on apparent social class or profession, no reserved section for the important in the ordinary, just Americans eating. Anyone could order anything. Anyone could sit anywhere. The waitress treated the factory worker with the same matter-of-fact friendliness as the man in the better suit. In Germany, social stratification was visible and enforced in virtually every social interaction. Nazi ideology had added racial hierarchy on top of existing class divisions, creating a tiered society where your place determined everything about your experience of daily life. These men had grown up in that system. They understood it as natural. And here, in a small-town American diner, a 14-year-old waitress was refilling a factory worker's coffee with the same automatic courtesy she'd given the man in the tie. The newspapers and magazines that began circulating through the camps in 1944 delivered the numbers that put everything they had witnessed into cold, irrefutable statistical form. American production figures for 1944, published openly in American media without the slightest attempt at concealment. Sugar, approximately 7 million tons. Chocolate and cocoa products, 380 million pounds for the military alone. Coca-Cola, 5 billion bottles in 1943. Ice cream, over 500 million gallons. Milk, 119 billion pounds. These were not propaganda figures. They were public production statistics, available in any library, reported in any newspaper, discussed openly in a society that saw no reason to hide its abundance. German production during the same period, sugar, heavily rationed, produced primarily from beets, chronically insufficient. Chocolate allocated to military priority only. Soft drinks essentially non-existent in civilian supply. Ice cream virtually eliminated. Milk severely rationed and often unavailable. America's wartime production achieved while fighting a two-ocean war, while equipping allies across the globe, while training and deploying millions of soldiers, exceeded Germany's peacetime peaks. In virtually every consumer category, while at war, while rationing, this was American wartime scarcity. And then came late 1944, and the reversal that cut deepest of all. German prisoners in American camps began sending packages home to Germany. Using their camp wages, the 80 cents to $1 per day earned through labor, prisoners purchased American products and mailed them back across the Atlantic. Chocolate bars, instant coffee, canned goods. International Red Cross records confirmed the scale of this phenomenon. German prisoners in America sent approximately 11 million parcels to Germany during their captivity, the vast majority containing food items. Let that reverse completely. Prisoners of war, men held in enemy custody, sending food relief packages to their free families back home. Because the prisoners were better fed than the civilians, because the men in American prison camps had more access to chocolate and coffee and canned goods than German citizens living in freedom under the Third Reich. Children in Germany received chocolate bars from fathers who were prisoners of war. Families received packages of American food from men who were technically under enemy guard. And the impact of those packages on the families who received them, families who had been told for years that America was weak and Germany was strong, and who were simultaneously receiving American candy from captured German soldiers while going hungry themselves, was devastating to whatever remained of ideological faith in the Nazi system. The physical evidence was becoming impossible to argue with.
Medical examinations conducted in prisoners preparing for repatriation in 1945 and 1946 showed that German prisoners of war generally returned to Germany healthier than when they had been captured. Many had gained significant weight. Their nutritional status had improved across their years of captivity. They were returning to families who had lost weight, to a homeland gripped by starvation, to cities reduced to rubble, to a nation where the caloric intake of surviving civilians had dropped to levels that medical professionals classified as slow starvation. And the men who had been eating ice cream in Tennessee and drinking Coca-Cola in Texas were walking back into that landscape, visibly healthier, carrying the last Red Cross packages that would become family treasures. Children who had forgotten what chocolate tasted like received Hershey bars from fathers who had eaten ice cream every week for 2 years in an American prison camp. The numbers that framed this final contrast were as clean and brutal as anything in the historical record. American daily consumption for German prisoners of war in American camps, 1943 to 1946, 3,300 to 3,600 calories per day, 4 pounds of sugar monthly, freely available, 32 ounces of meat weekly, a quart of milk daily where available, ice cream served regularly during summer months, soft drinks unlimited at 5 cents each from the camp exchange. German civilian rations during the same period, 1,200 to 1,500 calories per day, a level nutritionists classify as inadequate for basic health. 280 grams of sugar monthly when available at all. 10.5 ounces of meat weekly, frequently unavailable. Milk severely rationed and often unavailable. Ice cream virtually eliminated. Soft drinks none. These numbers were not propaganda. They were documented reality, cross-referenced across military records, Red Cross reports, and post-war testimony. Enemy prisoners ate better than German civilians. That sentence is not an exaggeration or an emotional flourish. It is a mathematical fact, verified across multiple independent documentary sources. American rationing, the complaints, the sacrifice, the hardship that Americans discussed openly and groused about freely, was operating at levels Germans would have found almost incomprehensibly generous. American sugar rationing during the war capped consumption at 2 pounds per person per month, more than 3 times the German civilian allowance when available. American meat rationing at 28 ounces weekly per person exceeded what German civilians received monthly. Even rationed, even cutting back, even sacrificing, Americans maintained consumption levels that Germans classified as impossible luxury. The Office of Price Administration's own records show Americans consumed approximately 74 pounds of sugar per capita in 1944, despite active rationing. 10 times German consumption. 10 times! And yet, American newspapers and housewives complained about the sacrifice of rationing. Spring 1945. As Allied forces pushed into the heart of Germany, German prisoners in American camps watched newsreels of Allied GIs moving through German cities and towns. And what they saw completed the final chapter of the education that had begun with a K ration in Tunisia. American soldiers advancing through enemy territory, through the rubble of cities the prisoners had grown up in, through towns where their families still lived, were handing out chocolate bars and chewing gum to German children. Children who had spent years being told by their government that American candy didn't exist, that American abundance was a myth, that Germany's discipline and sacrifice would bring them victory and prosperity. Those children were receiving Hershey bars from the soldiers who had just defeated their father's army. The children's faces in the newsreels told the whole story. Their joy at receiving American candy, candy their own government had been unable to provide, candy that soldiers from a supposedly weak and decadent democracy were apparently carrying in sufficient quantities to hand out freely in occupied territory, was not complicated joy. It was pure, unambiguous, the simping immediate joy of a hungry child receiving something sweet. And the prisoners watching those newsreels understood what they were seeing. The Allied soldiers advancing through Germany were not stripping the land bare. They were not extracting resources to feed a depleted homeland. They were handing out chocolate. Because they had enough. Because America always had enough. Because American abundance was not a propaganda claim or a temporary wartime posture. It was the baseline reality of a society built on productive capacity rather than conquest. Shortly afterwards, the newsreels brought the concentration camp liberation footage.
American soldiers sharing their rations with the skeletal survivors of Dachau and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen, men who had fought across France and Belgium and into the German heartland, men who had every reason for vengeance, giving their food to the victims of the regime the prisoners had served, demonstrating humanity not as a calculated gesture, but as an instinct, as the natural response of men from an abundant society who saw suffering and immediately reached for whatever they had to offer. The prisoners who watched those films in camp recreation rooms experienced something that the historical record captures only in fragments, in letters home that were censored and preserved, in post-war interviews conducted years and decades later. But the accounts consistently describe a specific quality of silence in those rooms after the lights came up. Not the silence of men who had nothing to say, the silence of men for whom words had temporarily ceased to be adequate. The return began in 1945 and continued through 1946. German prisoners of war processed for repatriation passed through medical examinations that documented their physical condition, gathered their final Red Cross packages, and began the journey back to a Germany that no longer existed in any form they had left it. They returned to rubble, to families weakened by genuine starvation, to cities where the caloric math of survival was a daily emergency, to a country that had promised them destiny and delivered catastrophe. And they came back healthy, well-fed, many of them actually heavier than when they had surrendered in the Tunisian dust. The physical contrast was impossible to intellectualize away. You could not stand in front of your hungry family, visibly well-fed from years in an American prison camp, and maintain any remaining faith in the ideology that had sent you to fight in the first place. The body knew the truth. The body had been living the truth for 2 years, 3 meals a day, plus canteen purchases, plus Red Cross packages, plus Thanksgiving turkey and Christmas cookies from Oklahoma church ladies. The last Red Cross packages became family treasures in a way that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't lived through the war. Chocolate bars were rationed out square by square over weeks. Instant coffee was measured out by the spoonful. Canned goods were saved for special occasions. Children who had spent years eating reduced rations sat with wide eyes while fathers who had been prisoners of war told them about ice cream sundaes and Coca-Cola and candy bars stacked 5 rows deep in camp exchange stores. It sounded like a fairy tale. It was completely true. In the years that followed, in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, as West Germany began the grinding work of rebuilding, something unexpected happened with these former prisoners of war. Rather than becoming bitter, rather than nurturing the resentment that defeat and captivity might reasonably have produced, rather than retreating into the comfortable myth that Germany had been betrayed rather than beaten, many of them became advocates for the Marshall Plan, for American assistance, for the reconstruction model that the American government was proposing for Western Europe. And they did this not because they had been brainwashed by a formal re-education program, though such programs existed and have their own complex history, but because they had seen something with their own eyes that could not be unseen. They had watched American abundance in action, and they had understood, in a way that no lecture or pamphlet could have conveyed, that it was not zero-sum, that American prosperity had not been achieved by extracting wealth from others, that German economic theory of Lebensraum, the idea that Germany needed to conquer eastern territories to have enough resources to prosper, was not just defeated, it was wrong, fundamentally, structurally wrong about how prosperity
prosperity is actually created. America had not prospered by conquest, it had prospered by production, by standardization, by distribution, by creating systems that made abundance available across a continental scale to people at every level of society. The Coca-Cola that cost 5 cents at Camp Crossville cost 5 cents everywhere in America for everyone in America, produced in the same quality, delivered through an infrastructure that reached every gas station and school and small-town diner in the country. That was not the product of conquest, it was the product of industrial democracy. And the men who had experienced it firsthand, who had tasted it, literally tasted it, 3 meals a day plus canteen privileges, plus Red Cross packages, plus Thanksgiving turkey and Christmas cookies from Oklahoma church ladies. The last Red Cross packages became family treasures in a way that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't lived through the war. Chocolate bars were rationed out square by square over weeks. Instant coffee was measured out by the spoonful. Canned goods were saved for special occasions. Children who had spent years eating reduced rations sat with wide eyes while fathers who had been prisoners of war told them about ice cream sundaes and Coca-Cola and candy bars stacked 5 rows deep in camp exchange stores. It sounded like a fairy tale. It was completely true. In the years that followed, in the late 1940s and into the 1950s, as West Germany began the grinding work of rebuilding, something unexpected happened with these former prisoners of war. Rather than becoming bitter, rather than nurturing the resentment that defeat and captivity might reasonably have produced, rather than retreating into the comfortable myth that Germany had been betrayed rather than beaten, many of them became advocates for the Marshall Plan, for American assistance, for the Reconstruction model that the American government was proposing for Western Europe. And they did this not because they had been brainwashed by a formal re-education program, though such programs existed and have their own complex history, but because they had seen something with their own eyes that could not be unseen. They had watched American abundance in action, and they had understood, in a way that no lecture or pamphlet could have conveyed, that it was not zero-sum, that American prosperity had not been achieved by extracting wealth from others, that German economic theory of Lebensraum, the idea that Germany needed to conquer eastern territories to have enough resources to prosper, was not just defeated, it was wrong, fundamentally, structurally wrong about how prosperity is actually created. America had not prospered by conquest, it had prospered by production, by standardization, by distribution, by creating systems that made abundance available across a continental scale to people at every level of society. The Coca-Cola that cost 5 cents at Camp Crossville cost 5 cents everywhere in America for everyone in America, produced in the same quality, delivered through an infrastructure that reached every gas station and school and small-town diner in the country. That was not the product of conquest, it was the product of industrial democracy. And the men who had experienced it firsthand, who had tasted it, literally tasted it, 3 meals a day plus canteen privileges, plus Red Cross packages, plus Thanksgiving turkey and Christmas cookies from Oklahoma church ladies. The last Red Cross packages became family treasures in a way that would have been incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't lived through the war. Chocolate bars were rationed out square by square over weeks. Instant coffee was measured out by the spoonful. Canned goods were saved for special occasions. Children who had spent years eating reduced rations sat with wide eyes while fathers who had been prisoners of war told them about ice cream sundaes and Coca-Cola and candy bars stacked 5 rows deep in camp exchange stores. It sounded like a fairy tale. It was completely true.
When Coca-Cola returned to West Germany in 1949, it was not simply a beverage. For former prisoners of war, it was recognition. The thing they had drunk in Tennessee and Mississippi and Texas, that impossible 5-cent symbol of American industrial democracy, was now available in German grocery stores. The transformation was underway. The future they had tasted in prison was arriving.
In post-war interviews and memoirs collected across the following decades, German prisoners of war returned again and again to specific sensory memories. Not the grand strategic sweep of ideological transformation, not the abstract realization of American industrial supremacy. Specific moments, specific tastes. The fizz of the first Coca-Cola, the cold shock of the first spoonful of ice cream, the sweet density of a Hershey bar, the casual warmth of a mess hall on a cold Tennessee morning with unlimited coffee and sugar and more food than you could eat. A former Africa Corps officer speaking in a 1975 interview about his time at Camp Crossville was asked what had changed his understanding of the war most fundamentally. He did not talk about military strategy. He did not talk about the liberation films. He said, "We expected to defeat a weak, divided America. Instead, we found a nation that could give ice cream to enemies. That's when we knew we had lost more than a war. We had lost our entire world view." Another veteran, interviewed for a documentary in 1985, was asked about his clearest memory of American captivity. He described his first Coca-Cola. "It was like drinking the future," he said. "Sweet, fizzing, completely unnecessary, available to anyone for a nickel." That drink contained everything Nazi Germany wasn't: abundant, democratic, joyful. Abundant, democratic, joyful. 3 words to describe a soft drink. 3 words that demolished an ideology. The story of German prisoners of war in America is not a simple story about American generosity, though American generosity was genuinely part of it. It's not a simple story about propaganda or psychological operations, because almost none of it was designed with that intent. It is a story about what happens when the truth is large enough that you cannot avoid experiencing it. When the evidence is not presented in a pamphlet but delivered 3 times a day on a tray. When the argument is not made in a lecture hall but made in a camp exchange where a nickel buys a Coca-Cola and another nickel buys a candy bar, and the man handing them to you is the enemy who somehow has enough to spare. These men arrived in America having been taught that strength meant dominance and abundance came from conquest. They left having experienced something their ideology had no framework for: a society so productively powerful that it could afford to treat enemies with dignity, feed them better than their own government fed its citizens, give them ice cream in the summer and turkey at Thanksgiving, and Christmas cookies from church ladies who had every reason to hate them and instead chose to bake. They had been taught that American weakness was moral, that the softness of democracy, the chaos of freedom, the weakness of a society that let individuals choose what to eat and what to buy and what to think was a fatal flaw that German discipline would inevitably overcome. And they discovered, one mess hall at a time, one camp exchange at a time, one 5-cent Coca-Cola at a time, that American abundance was not the product of weakness, it was the proof of strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need to take from others because it has learned to create. The society that could give Coca-Cola to prisoners for 5 cents possessed a kind of power that military might can demonstrate but not replicate. The power to produce so much that generosity becomes the default. The power to create systems so efficient that abundance flows outward automatically, reaching enemy prisoners and church ladies in Oklahoma, and children in school cafeterias, and dock workers on lunch breaks, and everyone, everyone, everyone. Today, McDonald's operates over 1,400 restaurants in Germany. Coca-Cola is as common in German grocery stores as water. Ice cream is ordinary, available in gas stations and school cafeterias and small-town diners in exactly the way that stunned and broke the worldview of the men who first encountered it in Tennessee in 1943. The transformation that began with a K ration in Tunisia is, in a very real sense, complete. But the lesson it carries is not complete. The lesson never becomes obsolete. Ideological transformation through abundance rather than deprivation, through demonstration rather than propaganda, through the simple, radical act of treating enemies as human beings and feeding them accordingly, and trusting that when a man has experienced enough truth with his own senses, he will eventually have to reckon with what he knows. The German prisoners of war who couldn't believe the ice cream and Coca-Cola in American prison camps became, in the end, the most credible witnesses democracy ever produced. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because they tasted it, because they lived it, because the evidence was in their bodies, literally in their bodies, when they walked home to their hungry families and tried to explain what America was actually like. And the message they carried, the testimony they gave in post-war interviews and over family dinner tables and in the boardrooms of rebuilding companies and the offices of reconstruction governments was not complicated, it was not political, it was not ideological in the new sense replacing the old. It was simple. They had been on the other side of abundance. They knew what it looked like from the inside, and they knew what it meant. America was not weak. America was not divided. America was not soft. America was a nation so extraordinarily productive, so genuinely committed to democratic access to the fruits of that productivity, that it fed its enemies ice cream and charged them a nickel for a Coca-Cola and sent their prisoners home healthier than when it had captured them. That is not weakness wearing the mask of strength. That is strength so complete it has nothing to prove. The men who learned that lesson, who learned it in the mess halls and camp exchanges and school lunch cafeterias and small-town diners of wartime America, carried it home and built with it. And the world they helped build is still, imperfectly and beautifully, and with all its ongoing struggle, being built today. If this story hit you the way it hit me, if you found yourself stopping to think about what it actually means that ice cream and a 5-cent soft drink did more to reshape history than some of the most elaborate propaganda programs ever designed, share this video. Because stories like this one, the ones that happen quietly while the famous battles get all the attention, are the ones that actually tell us who we are and what we're capable of. And if you want more forgotten stories from World War II, the ones that didn't make the textbooks but changed the world anyway, subscribe, because there are hundreds more where this one came from, and every single one of them will make you see the war and the world it made completely differently.